Hello and welcome to another episode of Crushing Comics, the show where I fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. And here's what we're going to fall in love with today. I think we're going to fall in love with this one. Pretty solid package of probably more than one book, I would imagine. Do you remember what it was like pre-internet, if you have pre-internet memories? But even if you don't, looking for that one thing that made you excited as you were like driving around in a new place, which for a lot of us I have to imagine was a comic book store. Also like a gaming store, like, you know, because I was into Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. And in the pre-internet days, I mean, if you knew you were going to be going somewhere, like if you were going to be on vacation somewhere, you would like, I don't even know how I would sometimes look ahead. I guess I would get there and I would look in the phone book, like in the hotel or whoever's house we were staying in, to see like, are there comic shops here? But that was an unusual amount of preparation on my part. I think usually you just had your eyes peeled as you were driving around. And that wasn't even for a vacation. Like, if you were just driving around in some new suburb and like passing the strip malls in that suburb, I don't know about you, but I would absolutely have my eyes peeled for like, does that place look like it has like comics or miniatures? And if it was, I would take note and say like, oh hey, that was interesting, Mom or Dad. So that on the return trip, I could maybe like beg my way into making a pit stop there to see if they had anything that was interesting. Because in the pre-internet days, there wasn't this idea, or even in the early internet days for that matter, there wasn't this idea that you could just go online and get the thing that you wanted to get. Like that's what's just so crazy about not only being online and not only the existence of digital, but the existence of these books, was that I remember trying to get runs of certain titles and it was just impossible because the selection didn't exist. I mean, even fairly common titles like Excalibur, which, you know, was a major X-Men title at that point, but it wasn't like every single shop had every single Excalibur issue, and they weren't expensive issues, but it took me a while to get them all. And I just remember any time that I would find a new place that had comics, even if it wasn't a dedicated comic store, it became like a pin in my map of the way that I thought about Philadelphia. And if I knew we were going to go to an errand near there or something, I would go, oh, hey, can we stop in that place? And so I can rifle through the back issues. And it's just amazing because it's one of those instances where I think the digital world has, in a way, changed our experience with the map of the physical world, because do you really feel that way about that kind of thing anymore? Not just comic book stores. Maybe if it's the kind of thing where you can only really experience it physically, like a place, I know another one for me is like local ice cream, like a place that makes its own ice cream. I still get really excited about that. Maybe people with like antiquing would get excited about that sort of thing. But the idea of trying to find a place that sells relatively obscure or nerdy product like comic books or baseball cards or whatever, it just doesn't really exist anymore. I don't think it does. Not for me anyway. Oh hey, so this is the final bundle, the missing middle bundle of Brian Bendis Avengers books. So let me get them in a logical order here, and we'll talk about them. So I think the first one to probably talk about is Mighty Avengers Assemble, which was the first oversized hardcover of Mighty Avengers. You've heard me mention this a few times. So we're coming out of Civil War. Cap and Iron Man have had their disagreement, and Iron Man, as a result, can't really associate with the existing New Avengers. They don't wish to be registered. He is the poster child for registration, and he feels that, as this government representative, he ought to have a team of representative registered Avengers. And so he recruits Miss Marvel, who's one of my favorite comic book characters of all time, and she is pretty fresh off of House of M at this point, and in House of M, she was one of the major heroes of the world, and returned to our reality thinking, why am I not? And her series had been running for about 2.5 or 3 arcs by the time that Civil War was over, and so Iron Man goes to her and says, I think you should be a part of this team. I think you should be a leader on this team, and you should have like equal say to me. And so she joins, but then the rest of the team that they put together, they don't have a lot of traditionally, at least modern traditionally, Avengers heroes on it, because there's this problem of people who will reveal their real identity and register. So on here is Sentry and Ares, and it's kind of funny to me that the two of them could be thought of as Avengers, because like Sentry doesn't even really have a secret identity. I mean, he kind of does, but he's just this all-powerful concept that was retroactively inserted into continuity, and Ares is a god. But you know what? It also has Black Widow and Wasp. And this was Wasp sort of coming back into prominence, even though she was shuffled off stage at the end of Secret Invasion. Bendis does bring her back at the end of his run, and she's kind of been visible in the Avengers franchise ever since then in a way that's definitely much like more participatory and more cool than she had been before. I've also mentioned that that book was Bendis taking a slightly different approach. He doesn't quite push the chatting heads as much as he does in New Avengers, and it's got a much more classic tone with narrative boxes and things like that. So then that proceeds directly into Secret Invasion, which is just the next few arcs of Mighty Avengers, and I don't know that I really have anything too different to tell you about it. The thing to know, though, is that basically Secret Invasion was a plot that was just going to be playing out across New Avengers and Mighty Avengers that got promoted to an event. And in its promotion to event, what Bendis was allowed to do was use the issues of his two Avengers titles as more background material, establishing where did the skulls come from, why are they having this conflict, how did they infiltrate us. In fact, one of the issues in here isn't really an Avengers issue at all. It turns out to be the backdoor pilot for Secret Warriors, which Brian Bendis co-launches with Jonathan Hickman. Although he writes this issue, but he co-launched the series with Jonathan Hickman. These two Mighty Avengers oversized hardcovers represent the full thrust of Bendis' run on that before Slott and Gage take it over, which actually I guess we just saw in 2 episodes ago. And both of those have been collected into a complete collection that has been pretty freshly released, I think, in paperback. So we don't yet have an anthology of all of the remaining Mighty Avengers in paperback. It's funny how I'm plucking these off in like semi-order, because I swear these have been shuffled so much. Like they were all over when they got packed, and then they went to all different boxes, and then they got reconsolidated in the boxes when we got here, and then they got put on the shelf. So it's really hilarious when I pull two out that have anything to do with each other. So then this is the end of Brian Bendis' run on New Avengers, of course, which then turns into Avengers and New Avengers in 2010. So this picks up in the middle of the Secret Invasion material. That is number 5. And even more so than Mighty Avengers, Bendis is really not writing his primary Avengers at all in this. It is all Skrull-tastic, and it's kind of a little bit of a slog. Like, if you have this and Secret Invasion, or even if at the time you're reading both, it's kind of fun because this is giving you the background. But when I got to Avengers in my Marvel read and I was reading this material, I was just like, what is this? I don't understand. Where are the Avengers? And it's kind of funny because when you reread these things in the future, and there's no dispute that comics are being made to be like reread and reconsumed at this point. When you reread them in the future, you don't have all that context. Like, you don't know what was coming out the same month as that comic and why the narrative that was originally there was going to get shifted into an event. And it becomes part of this ongoing oral history, not only in this YouTube show, but as part of like everybody's knowledge about comics that they talk about in conversation. And what's interesting is, like, as some of that gets lost, opinions change about the comics, right? Something that might have been really thrilling at the time, finding out what was happening behind the scenes with the Skrulls, seems like a slog when you're reading it in a collected edition later and you don't have the context of what was coming out alongside, which I think is a huge reason why Marvel never really leapt right into releasing a New Avengers by Brian Bendis Volume 2 omnibus. Recently announced they're actually doing a Secret Invasion omnibus, and the contents have caused a little bit of contention in the fan base because it doesn't pick up cleanly from New Avengers. It has issues 31 and 32, and then it skips some stuff, and then it picks up and runs, but not quite to the end of a volume, and that was previously collected, and people are like, what's with all the gaps? But what the Secret Invasion Omnibus does is it gets all of that context together and says, here it is. Here are all of the things related to Secret Invasion that maybe we're reading a little bit slowly on their own if we'd put them in an omnibus, and all of a sudden the focus just shifted to Skrulls for 10 issues. But here, contextualized with the Secret Invasion and the Mighty Avengers issues, it's much more interesting. So then there's sort of the end of New Avengers here in volumes 6 and 7 rather. I actually enjoy issue 6 because it's got some interesting stuff going down. There's this ongoing thread of like Jessica Jones defects to Mighty Avengers because she feels that it's more protective for her child with Luke Cage, and like, what does she have to hide? Everybody knows she's Jessica Jones, but Luke Cage on principle like can't join them, and that keeps playing out at the beginning of this, which is coming right out of Secret Invasion. And so there's some like side switching, but then in addition to kind of having the Mighty Avengers to avoid, at this point there's also the Dark Avengers, you can see in the back cover here. And so then the Avengers, starting with issue 50, are having their conflict with Dark Avengers. And what's interesting about that is Dark Avengers don't only want to hunt them down and like make them register and imprison them, but the Avengers feel like, who the hell are these people and what are they doing with our name? And so there's a lot of conflict in the group with like, we should go and take them down. They're imposters. I don't care if the government sponsors them. And Hawkeye in particular feels extremely strongly about this. And I kind of find that delightful. It's a really interesting concept that these teams are effectively arguing over the intellectual property rights of their name, but there's something much deeper about than that because it also represents how the public perceives them. However, I think the run falls apart a little bit in this last volume, volume 7. Like, it's got a little bit of the New Avengers and Dark Reign, but this gets into that, like, Bendis wheel spinning territory where a whole arc will go by and you kind of are, like, still trying to figure out, did anything happen? I remember it was really pretty. I remember people did some interesting things in a battle and they said some stuff, but did anything happen? And there's one particular arc in here with a supernatural element and which brings, like, Doctor Strange to the fore, which I've probably read it 3 or 4 times, and every time I'm finished, like, reading it or browsing it, I'm like, what was that? I'm sorry, did anything happen in that arc? It involved the Hood. I don't know. He's like a big blank spot. Hood stories, I don't know, maybe he was cool one time, but I tend to just gloss, I think, when I read stories of him. So now we have the entire oversized portion of Brian Bendis' Avengers Unwrapped. Back here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have all of this, and then the other side we have Dark Avengers and Mighty Avengers that we unwrapped earlier this week. So now you're like, great, I've got this whole bookshelf in oversized hardcover, where do I go from here? Well, the answer is nowhere in oversized hardcover. There is one oversized hardcover of the 2010 portion of Bendis' Avengers runs when New Avengers and Avengers relaunched in the Heroic Age, and it collects the first arc of each of those plus a miniseries called Avengers Prime that he also wrote that kind of brought together the Trinity, Iron Man, Cap, and Thor for the first time in quite a few years. But there's no oversized hardcovers after that, and Marvel seems in no rush to get there because they just reissued all of those series in their own complete collections. So it seems like our only hope to get there in oversized hardcover is going to be them finishing the omnibus line through here, which who knows how that's going to interact with the Secret Invasion omnibus. Is it going to collect around it and in its gaps, or are they just going to treat that as its own thing off to the side and press forward eventually, maybe years from now, with a Brian Bendis volume 2? But either way, there's got to be another 1 or 2 volumes before we make it into that 2010 stuff, and then the 2010 stuff itself represents probably 2 more volumes because it's 2 34-issue series and it can't fit into one omnibus. So if you've got oversized hopes for collecting the rest of Bendis after this, you're going to be waiting for quite a number of years, possibly forever. Although it's starting to seem like nothing is forever in terms of Marvel collections, because everything you buy and you think, oh, this was never going to happen, eventually happens in recollected format in some way. I think we've all learned our lesson in the last couple of years not to chase down really expensive trade paperbacks because everything comes back. Even, you know, complete collections of Nova at this point, which I don't think anybody ever predicted. And he's not even a character that's super hot right now, but Marvel just finds a way to get there. So with that all said, here is the ceremonial shelving of the rest of Brian Bender's Avengers. Bendis' Avengers. And there's no room on the shelf next to the other ones right now, so I'm just going to put them down here, which is pretty amazing that we have progressed all the way to a 1, 2, 3, 4th level of shelves. Thank you so much for watching and listening to me talk my way through the rest of Brian Bendis' Avengers. Tune in next time for more unpacking as I learn to love this comic book collection all over again. Thanks so much.